on at the social affairs theme of the European Political Strategy Center. And last but not least, Bernard Segol, who was the former Secretary General of the European Trade Union Confederation. So the issue is very, very topical today, social inequalities and what to do with that. We know that in Europe, certainly the situation in social inequalities are typically much narrower than elsewhere in the world, but it doesn't mean that there are no problems in Europe. In fact, we see many, many calls for more social Europes from various segments. We have now the social pillar and many other attempts to reinforce the social pillar of the European Union. But what I most like in this report, and that's why I'm very pleased that Maurizio came here to present, is that it goes very much beyond averages, like the Gini coefficient for Italy is higher than in let's say in Belgium, that we all know. But it looks very much into the details between different cohorts of people, between different education, different regions, and also tries to bring, I think, very nicely the facts. There's a lot of research in this report. I very much recommend to all of you to research. So a lot of facts, a lot of research, and also the policy side, what are the possible remedies to the problems that have been identified. So without further ado, let me pass the word to Maurizio, who will present you the report in about 20 minutes. We will see. I will check the time. And then we have our two excellent discussants. We have a little bit group discussion, and then I will open the floor so everybody will have a chance to ask a question or to make a comment. But first of all, Maurizio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. I think it's in an era of Twitter where everything is really short and compressed. 20 minutes is a bit tough, but I'll do my best. This is not just a research product where there is a research question, data, methodology, and answer, but I need some time to develop the story, but I'll skip the details and try to stick to a minimum amount of time. So let me start then with this first slide, and in fact everything is in this first slide. So if you get these 4 messages that I have, you have the storyline of the report. If you go out and you remember these 4 things, I'll be happy. So we started 3 years ago with a smaller piece of study that was called Polarization and Populism, where we basically found that the voting across many countries, not just in Europe, Central Asia, but also elsewhere, was moving towards the extreme of the political spectrum. And we hypothesized several potential reasons, economic reasons, but it was a brief study, and we thought, no, this requires more investment, so we did this other longer report. The starting point is that, okay, so you have these mega trends, as someone called them. Globalization, technological change for Europe is fairly relevant, not for all the countries, but for many. Aging. These trends have created enormous opportunities, but also cleavages in societies, okay? And so when you study these issues, we make 4 contributions in this debate. The first one is that, as was said at the very beginning, you have to go beyond the vertical inequality. So you have to go beyond what is normally measured in these countries, which is inequality across all individuals and all households. Okay, so the disparity of incomes. This is what is called the vertical inequality, what is measured by the Gini, etc. I had to do some convincing with my senior management, because this region, Europe, compared to other regions in the world, in terms of levels, but also in terms of trends, is not the most unequal and becoming more unequal of the world. So why do we need a report on inequality? Well, if you go beyond that, and that's the first contribution, the nature of inequality has changed, and if you look at disparities across groups rather than across individuals. When you group together different groups, you see that there are disparities, and these disparities don't necessarily reflect yet in the overall Gini, but they are strong and increasing. And one other important thing that is part of this is that even if the inequality vertical doesn't change, so the Gini has remained constant, the process through which that inequality, that distribution of income is generated has become possibly more unfair. So people tolerate less that level of inequality, okay? So even if it's stable, but it's less fair, it's not so tolerable. So that's the first contribution. The second contribution is that, the second contribution is that, again, this is the region where there has been, where there are the most developed welfare states, redistribution system, regulations of the labor market. So institutionally, we are in a region where we have the instruments to deal with distributional tensions. However, and we show, and that's the second contribution, these systems were created to take care of different kind of tension and not so well designed anymore to take care of the distributional tension that arise. So it's not that we have to scrap it, it's not that they're doing worse, but we need to think more creatively. So that's the second contribution. The third one is, okay, think of the first two as, allow me think of the first two as the supply of equity, the equity that is generated by the market and enhanced, corrected, changed by the government, and put it against the demand for equity. So that's the third part. We look at what people want in terms of equity, and we find that they are complaining, they are reporting, I shouldn't say complaining, but they are reporting a sense of uneasiness, and when asked, they all report that inequality has been increasing, even if objectively has not. So how do we explain that gap? We have some contribution in the report. So once you put these three together, you see that there is a potential imbalance, and so we move to the last contribution, which is when there is this imbalance and there are cracks in the social contract, how to take care of that? How do we remedy that? And so there is a bit of a discussion of what to do about that, and we suggest this principle, universalism, security, and progressivity that I have some time in the end to explain in more detail. That's the storyline of the report. So if anyone has something else to do, they can leave. But if you remember, these are the main points. Now, what I do in the next in the time that is left is give you some examples. I will selectively talk about some things, and so I will cover some countries, not others. And in the discussion, maybe we can go into more details. But before doing that, let me give you a word about this big terminology, social contract. So there is a large literature, political science, philosophy that goes back to big names, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. We don't go there, so we have a much narrower economist point of view of that, and we think of the social contract in simple terms. That is a dynamic equilibrium, an equilibrium that changes through time among these three elements. The first one, as I already mentioned, the market forces generate distribution of resources. The second one, there is intervention of the government, of the public sector. These interventions are not just post-market tax and transfer redistribution. Think of them along the whole gamut. So think of them in pre-market, so education prepares individuals for the labor market, and accumulation of assets before entering the market creates a distribution. So pre-market, in-market with regulation, and post-market with tax and transfer. So all of that changes the distribution. The third element is this perception, aspirations about equity. And when these three are in equilibrium, there is a stable social contract. The social contract can go astray if any of these changes and the other two don't change in sync. Okay, so you can have only one element and the others are not changes, and you have some problems. Normally things move in sync or move with delay, and things remain, the social contract remains stable, but if there is a persistent imbalance, then you begin having a problem. So the report is organized around in graphical terms. This is what I talked about, the three elements, and so the reports focus on analyzing the three. So let me start with the first one. I'll give you some example of the market forces, the first part of the of the report. As I said, vertical inequality doesn't change much. This is the Gini for Europe and Central Asia, for a bunch of countries grouped across sub-regions. So they're not all the countries are grouped across regions. If you compare the Gini today, 2014, which is the latest 15, with the Gini of when the Berlin Wall fell, yes, inequality is higher, but if you compare it with after 95, it's sort of stable. If you go towards a specific country, there are some peaks, etc., but it doesn't seem to be so high. By the way, not just trends, if you look at Southern Europe, which is the highest inequality, is 0.35. So this is a low Gini. Gini goes from 0, perfect equality, to 1, perfect inequality. 3.5, which is Southern Europe, is low. A normal and high inequality country in Latin America is around 0.5. Colombia is one of the most unequal. So it's low. There's one big caveat. With these household survey, don't include top incomes, all the Paris School of Economics, Piketty group. If you look at concentration of income at the top using those data, you see some increase in that concentration. But even there, it's not common across all of Europe. So vertical inequality is not enough. You have to go beyond that. And so we look at the different groups. The groups that we look at are these. Generations of birth cohort, occupations in the labor market, and region spatial inequality. We miss some. One key one that we miss is native versus immigrants group. Another one could be gender, men against women, but we have for now those. And then there is this other one that I mentioned that is the process, the fairness. Let me give you one example of birth cohort. So birth cohort, when it's not just comparing in a moment of time old people with young people, but it's actually comparing what has been the experience of a certain cohort in a certain age with another cohort at the same age. So we want to disentangle the cohort effect from the age effect. If you just look at the cross-section, you can't do that. So what I have here is one example of a distributional tension on the incidence of non-standard type of employment, temporary, part-time, agency work, the Uber driver, etc. Okay, so it's not just that. So if you look at these are two parts of the regions, different age groups, in different moment of time. Okay, so if you look at there is an overall increase for all age group and for all cohorts across time, more in Southern Europe than in Western Europe for these non-incidence, non-standard employment. But if I highlight now the cohorts that were born more recently, so the youngest age group, at the beginning of the period, which is 82, there wasn't that much difference. The incidence was the same for the blue line and for the other line. But if you look much more recently, the cohorts, the more young cohort, bear much more an incidence of that than the other cohorts. So there has been a distributional tension in terms of the incidence of these type of jobs. So they may have the same income, but actually they have much more uncertainty. And in fact, they don't have the same income either, because in this graph I show you just that. It's the same kind of information, but now I look at the wage growth of different cohorts in 4 important years when they are 30, 31, in 5 years, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. So you have 2 groups here, and this is only for Southern Europe. It's not exactly the same for other regions, so this is a sub-region where it's particularly strong. But look at the 2 groups. If you are a high school graduate, there wasn't much of growth in your wages for these years between 30 and 34. So it was flat for the cohorts born in the past and for the more recent cohorts at the same age, okay? But look at the college graduate. What happens? The older cohorts had a fairly strong increase in their wages in these 4 years, but the whole profile flattens for the younger cohorts. The younger cohorts are on your right-hand side, and they are the red and these ones. And so you see that they are flattening. So they don't experience the same growth that at that age the older cohorts were experiencing. So more uncertainty in terms of occupation type and less growth of their income. So this is a level difference between cohorts that is a distributional tension. There is one third way of looking at this. There are even more in the report, and that is, now don't consider levels disparity between groups, but consider a same group, what happens within the group of a similar age. And these are 3 countries, Germany, France, and Italy, where we can go back fairly a lot. And this, on the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient of the within group inequality, and on the horizontal axis, you have the year they were born. Now, if I compare, and I get Italy because it's easy for me to talk about Italy, but if being Italian, the generation of my father was born about 1930s. When he was 35, I can measure the inequality that he experienced in the peer group of everybody that was about the same age of my father between when he was 35. He was experiencing an inequality that was similar to the one of Japan, of 0.31. In a few generations after that, in 1980s, so not the generation of my daughters, but a slightly older one, but they are experiencing, again at 35, an inequality that is much higher. It's as if they live in different countries, from Japan to Chile. And that's again not reflected in the overall inequality, but if you compare the situation with your peers' age group, you are living in a different kind of countries. So done with the cohorts, I have things on the occupation. There's a whole literature on occupation polarization. I don't have time to go through that, but let me emphasize. And there is spatial that I mentioned, but again, for time's sake, I cannot go into the details. So we find tensions in those contexts as well. Let me give you one more way that we look at this distributional tension, which is what happens to the middle class. Again, there is a lot of talk about the hollowing out of the middle class, the squeezed middle class, etc. If you measure that carefully, in terms of size, you don't see that much of a change in size of the middle class in these countries. You have to measure it slightly in a slightly different way in terms of insecurity. That's what we do here. So you have to be patient with this graph because it has a lot of information, but it's quite interesting. We measure for this on a panel for 2011, 5 and 8, 2005 and 8, the first period. We measure what is the probability of people falling into poverty, and that's the probability level that is on the horizontal axis. And we measure that by looking at what kind of assets they have, and we know that some people have fallen into poverty. On the same for the same people, we measure what is their income that is generated with these assets, and it's on the vertical axis there. Now, you can define the middle class as security to not fall into poverty, not being vulnerable to fall into poverty. If you decide that is about 8%, so you are middle class, if your probability of falling into poverty is below 8%, the income that you needed was about $34 a day. Do the same calculations after the crisis, 2011 and 14, that income has gone up to 40. So to maintain the same low vulnerability, now you have to pay an insurance premium of about 20%, from 34 to 40%. So maybe the size has not changed. I'm fighting with the microphone. Maybe the size has not changed, but the vulnerability has changed. And not everybody has. If you stay at 34, now your vulnerability is higher. So that's important. You have a question?
Still in Europe?
No, this is actually, this is not, this is whole countries that we have EU Silk, which is, it's not all the 28 countries, but it's for most countries. And we have repeated this. You need a panel, so not everywhere you have a panel. This has been done for Latin American countries and others, but you can't replicate to all the countries. So I also have data on the profile of people around this and the identity of people. Which people are there actually changes in the two periods, and it reflects the distributional tensions, the groups that are losing out that I described before. So there are some links, but I cannot go through that. I will skip all of this about inequality of opportunity, but we can talk about that. The main result I can tell you is that fairness or unfairness has not really increased, but there has been a change in nature. So there has been democratization of education in most countries. The skill premium has gone down. These two alone should have translated into a reduction for inequality of opportunity, but it didn't. And that is because parental background still matters. So circumstances that are not under your control still matter for the positions in the labor market that you have. And it goes through networking. It goes through your parents had a certain education on a certain school and have certain networks, and they can still influence where you end up. So that's one important finding. For Eastern European, there are different story. Inequality of opportunity in education is increasing. So I'm rushing. I have given you some flavor of what happens in the market. I'll show you one example of what happens in the public policy arena. The premise here is that it's still delivering very well in terms of vertical redistribution. The Gini coefficient in EU 28 goes from market income, pre-tax and transfer of 0.5 to 0.29, post-income, post-tax and transfer. So the tax and transfer redistribution system delivers enormously. It reduces 21 Gini points. So nowhere else in the world the system is so redistributive. Okay, so in that sense, it's a good system. This vertical redistribution has not changed so much in the last year. In France has increased, in Greece has increased. So in some other parts of the region has decreased, but not so much. So it delivers, but when you look at the horizontal inequality, the one that we care, it's not delivering so well. I'll show you an example for Hungary in terms of taxation. Okay, taxation in terms of what happened, what is the pressure, the fiscal pressure for different age groups. And you have two moments in time, different age groups, 2007, 2014, and you see that the taxation pressure as tax paid as a percentage of income has increased for the young group and gone down for the old group. So the flattening of the tax system that Hungary implemented has increased the pressure on the loser of the age group and decreased the pressure on the winner of the age group. And this is actually a policy choice, because the yellow line shows you that I can use the tax system, I can simulate the tax system of 2007 on the population of 2014, and that would not have changed the incidence. So it's really a change in policy that determines that increase in pressure for the young age group, a decrease in pressure for the old age group. We have example for the labor market regulations and other things that are, again, exacerbating or at least not taking care of the horizontal distribution. I am almost done. Finish off with the third element of the report that looks at the demand side. And as I said, people are saying that they feel that the inequality is going up, even if it's not. I don't have time to show you the details of that graph, but that's what we find. And so there's a literature that says some people. There's a very interesting, well done paper by Gimpelson and Daniel Treisman, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and Gimpelson is in Harvard, I think, which has a very interesting paper which is called Misperceiving Inequality. So you can dismiss that people are just don't know what inequality is and just say that it's going up. But you can actually argue that, no, maybe it's something else. It's not that the gene is wrong or they're misperceiving, but it's that they are measuring, they have in mind different things. By the way, there are also very different sensitivities of inequality aversions that depends on culture and attitude, cultural attitude, life experience, etc. Here I give you just an example from the World Value Survey. In the US, and that's well known, 70% of the people think that you can escape poverty without help from the government. That is very different in Europe, and in the Eastern Europe is even more low that fares. So people care about other things that is not just the money or that they have, but security, for example. There are the mobility. They care about mobility. Here, I show you why you have to go behind the dismissal of misperception. There's a question in LITS, the Life in Transition survey that we run with the EBRT, that asks this question. If you are to place yourself, your family today on a ladder of 10 steps, where the first step is the 10 bottom poorest people, the top step on the ladder is the 10 richest people, where will you put yourself today? And so the people answer these questions, and this is the summary of all the 31 countries that we have in that survey. And I plot the probability of you saying you belong to the first two bottom step, the poorest, the probability of feeling poor, against several controls, but against what I show you here, the actual position in the ladder. So it's not the perceived position, but it's the actual position. Clearly is downward sloping, but still some of the actual belong to the 10th believe they are poor. But what I care most is the comparison between the green and the blue line. They are the same question, but the blue line people have an employment do not have an employment that is continuative for the last 12 months. And that's the only difference between the blue and the line. So that difference, if I take an individual from the 6th decile, actual 6th decile, but it doesn't earn the money from a continuative employment, he always feels much poorer. And that gap in perception is equivalent to 3 actual levels of actual incomes. So if you want to compensate that insecurity with a transfer, you have to give him an enormous transfer of 3. Or said in other words, people value security a lot more than just level of income. So there is an imbalance. I am closing with the 3 principles. So what to do about that? Maybe we'll talk more in the discussion about this. But the 3 principles that we think have to be taken into account when you want to redesign the social contract are these. One is that we should have, as we have a universal provision of education and health risk, etc., there is an increase in economic risk, but this is not covered. The incidence of this enhanced economic risk is not covered well, and so we should go towards a more universal coverage of those risks. One way of thinking about that is via a UBI, but there are other ways to discuss that. But that's the first principle, to have a universal provision of insurance system and services. The second is that you should delink the type of protection or regulation that you encounter in the labor market from the type of employment that you have. So no matter if you are employed in a permanent employee-employer contract, but even if you are a temporary, you should have the same rights, pension rights, treatment, wages, etc. So that's the second. So leveling the playing field in the labor market. And then the third one, which you have to take into account all of these together, right? It's not that you can reform, pick one, I reform one and forget about the other ones. You have to have three together. The third one looks at the side of the taxation side. In an era where, where the progressivity has gone down and the tax base has been narrowed to labor, we should have enhanced progressivity and a very broad tax base, which include capital taxation in the form most likely as inheritance tax. So there's a lot of more detail. You can see these three principles in the IPSP, the International Panel of Social Progress, which is came out contemporarily to us with 3 volumes. They look at the similar things in Rescue the Loser, Prepare the Players, Changing the Rule of the Game, so they have a similar view. So everything is, as I said, everything is online, and this is you find it here, but you Google Europe and Central Asia towards a new social contract, and you find it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurizio, for this very interesting presentation. You know, it was a great challenge, I believe, because the report is so rich in many aspects, details, analysis, policy conclusions, that highlighting just a few key items on your long list must have been a very difficult task. But I think it gave a very nice overview of the various issues and also raised a number of issues, number of topics, which I'm sure we will discuss. But let's first have our two discussants. Maybe we go in alphabetical order, according to family name. So Ruby, how do you see the problems? And I presume you will also talk about Europe, what Europe is doing to address these issues.
Okay, Joel, thank you very much. And thanks also, Maurizio, for an amazingly concise and selective presentation of phenomenal issues. I mean, first of all, whoever hasn't yet read the report, I think really should. I started reading it online, and I found exactly what you said, the richness of it so tremendous that I did the unsustainable thing of asking to print it so that we can really go through. There's so much material, and I was trying to think, what is it that I can highlight in these 5 minutes that you generously gave us to open up the discussion? And I think I'll focus on 3 things. First of all, a couple of reactions to the report itself. Then secondly, like why this actually really matters for the discussions that are ongoing at the EU level. And then third, a couple of things that I would like to see maybe for your next report as well. So, pushing the research baton further. So why it's rich and timely, because I think it's not just the richness, it's the timeliness of it. I mean, okay, in academic circles, the discussions on inequality and fairness have been rich and constant for decades, zooming into migrant communities, zooming into people with second or third generations. I mean, looking at city, urban, rural divides. So the academic has been there. The policy part, or the political, let's say, possibly attention to some of these fairness and the needs to address some of the new risks has been a bit delayed, probably because there was at least a decade of growth and aspirations for this integrating the global economy and some of the points that you mentioned also in the report, and sorry for the echoing, I'll try not to move around too much. And then the crisis that really hit home hard in Europe, and then after that, really the discussion on what is it that we need to look at, what's changing on our labor markets, how it's impacting our society, our economy, and therefore also our politics, really brought these issues at the highest level of political attention. I mean, probably if you published this report a bit over a decade ago, you wouldn't get the traction that you'll be getting today. So it's timely also because probably the data and the facts are at the moment more important than ever in actually informing the debates that are happening. And some of these debates are happening in very simplistic ways in the general elections, in the EP elections that all our member states are having. So having giving now the policymakers the differences that you showed. So I'm sorry, it's not me. Between the Gini, so the inequality, and then actually looking at what this means between workers, between generations, between regions. There's now an acknowledgement and a tremendous pool of knowledge that politicians and policymakers can act on. It's also, I thought it was interesting that you linked it with Central Asia, because probably we're more aware than ever how what's happening in our labor market is completely dependent with what's happening in labor markets of our neighboring regions. I would love that. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'll just take this off. So what's happening in our labor markets is as I said, directly impacted with what's happening in the global labor market and specifically in our regions. And this has to do not just with the digital economy that just knows no borders now. So what's happening, how workers in other places have their rights protected or not, or how they're seeing opportunity, or what is pushing or pulling them to migrate, then matters for Europe. So thanks for putting it also in the wider geographic context. Now, look, when I was reading it, I was thinking then, where is it that this really matters for Europe? Because you said about how fair Europe is, and it's not by chance. This has been centuries long of steady investment in policies about education, about protection, in building the institutions, in getting the trade unions, the representations of the employers and the employees to work together to find collaborative solutions, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through collaboration. There's been a lot of investment in terms of financial resources and human resources. And this has delivered, and it's continuing. And now it's clear that the new risks that are arising, we're probably finally now able maybe to grasp our head around it. But it's a difficult process because the 28 member states have very different welfare and labor markets. So getting even some common agreement on which issues need to be prioritized and where and how is a challenge in itself, because some of the member states have actually had foresight and anticipation and have been looking at the challenges ahead, whether they're demographic, whether they're regional, urban, and have been shifting resources, experimenting, innovating phenomenally, and are really world leaders in these. Others haven't. And it's about getting all member states part of the debate. I think from the EU level, there's been really the last 3 years a very wide effort to bring social back and have the discussion. The pillar of social rights was the symbolic part of it in order to get the political commitment at the highest level. And it was probably, it's definitely an innovation and doesn't exist anywhere else in the world in terms of getting so many countries at high political level to commit in keeping this fairness, improving it, and trying to adjust it to the future. Now, obviously, that's not enough, because then it's how do you do what you have to do and then get reelected, right? Because that's the hard part. And I think the points that you raise on the fairness and the lack of opportunities for some places is playing out in 3 different things that matter for Europe. One has to do with the promise of upward convergence, which is what the EU project has been about. And if some regions either are falling behind the promise, then the perceptions kind of are magnified in even more important ways. And the frustrations then really play out in politics in some of the ways that we've seen in recent elections and the rise of Euroscepticism. So how to address this and maintain the promise of upward socioeconomic convergence for all in an inclusive way. Second, how to do this in a sustainable manner. And probably the one issue that then needs to, I think, be considered, and the next phase is also perhaps of your how to do this new social contract, has to do with sustainability and some of the interventions that we have been doing to address climate change and the societal impacts or the social impacts of these in some places more than others. And here, again, there's a lot of places that, deindustrialization, we didn't do it well enough. We left some places for a long time behind and at their own devices. And now there's a lot more effort to try to think ahead and see which regions will be impacted the most by the transition to the low carbon or the carbon neutral economy. These regions that tend to also be the more vulnerable and have higher levels of unemployment and poor educational systems, how do you then divert investments to these in a fair manner? So sustainability, I think, is probably the one, and how to have sustainable growth, but how to have the just transition as well, which European countries are leading on. And the third is creating a level playing field. And you mentioned it at some point, but I think it's beyond just between workers and between generations. It's finding ways to create a level playing field globally. And here probably is where the EU is under most pressure, because we've become very much aware that our shrinking demographics also come with shrinking economy and the economy shifting east. So how labor markets and how economy is shaped, other parts of the world are forming it. And we need to, with the digital economy and platforms and services and the way it's changing, we need to be able to get the rest of the world on board certain standards. So this is at a time where multilateralism is under strain. Organizations like the World Trade Organization on how to do trade fairly, the ILO, and the tremendous work that it has been doing on the future of work, how to get these again fit really for a global digital economy. And I think these are three challenges that Europe needs to address together, and this data is useful in order to get member states to realize kind of the tensions within. And I'll wrap up because I think there's a lot of questions probably from the floor for you. The two things that I would like to see more of, you said gender and migration, but I think it's not just looking back, but also maybe seeing how some of the intersections with what's happening in the labor market with digitization and skills affect these two particular population groups, where social cohesion has a risk of playing out in maybe challenging ways ahead. For gender, first of all, the rise in gender equality that we've had in the last few decades has been tremendous because of education and the educational tertiary attainment, especially of women. And then this phenomenon of assortative mating now, which is, men and women of similar educational backgrounds, then, and the social mobility part, like pairing up, and what that means then for the next round, because the biggest social mobility breakthrough happened in gender equality with female education, but now what is happening is not clear given the skills, the kind of jobs at the high and the low end of the spectrum in terms of pay, not necessarily skills. And the jobs that more men go to in the care sector, that women go to, and what that might mean for the next generation's income or other forms of inequality between the two genders. I think I would be interested in seeing a bit more on that. And the native migrant background is probably one of the most pressing political challenges for every next election, and it's relevant for every member state. So having the data to see how to do integration policies at all level better is probably really useful. So thank you. I think I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruby, for adding a number of interesting additional points to the presentation, including the European perspective, and also for highlighting some works which still need to be done. Now let me immediately pass the floor to Madame Segol for comments.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very interesting report. Yeah, so thank you, you understood. Yeah. I have 8 points. I'll try to go very quickly through them and very clearly. First of all, congratulations, because inequalities were not in the last 20 years top of the agenda of politicians and economists. And we, as trade unions, but also individuals, had to fight to put it on the agenda. And I think it's very good that the World Bank puts this on top of the list. So I congratulations for that. And it goes also with the view which was not recognized that inequalities are not simply a moral issue. It's up to you to decide whether it is or not an ethical problem, but it is an economic and political problem. And my view has always been that so long as we are not making inequality a problem for the economy, for the leaders, then we will not make our point. So I was always very careful to make it a problem for the stability of our societies, because stability of the societies are good for the economy and are good for politics. But it also brings two values that have been completely forgotten in the last 20 years, is that stability is a good thing and security is a good thing. I leave it to you. Is it or is it not a good thing? My view is that it is. And I think development are showing that we should consider stability and security not as values of the past, but values of the future. Second point, the nature of inequalities, their origin, you have done a great job. And there are 2 points I would have added. I don't know if it's because you didn't have the figures or I don't know why, but I will only touch on that. It's environment and technology. I mean, do we have rising inequalities because of these two elements, or is it something that you have to analyze in the future? But I won't go further into this. The third point, where I'm going to be a bit more critical, if I may, is touching on the solution you propose. You recommend flexibility. Now, it's very difficult for me to consider that flexibility is going to help, because we have experienced flexibility in many countries, and we know where this has led us. And I will only take the view of an organization which doesn't have the reputation of being on the extreme left of the social spectrum. It's the OECD. So the OECD is normally a very reasonable and moderate organization. And they have, in their last review of the job strategies, say that countries with policies and institutions, I quote, that promote job quality, job quantity, and greater inclusiveness perform better than countries where the focus of policy is predominantly on enhancing market flexibility. Now, I tell you, for us to read that in an OECD paper makes us feel very good. Now, I really think that this question has not been studied enough. If we all agree, or if we agree that flexibility, that stability is a good thing for the society, then we have to really think if your social pact is what needs rethinking, really, or is that, do we have to rethink what is flexibility and what should be flexibility? The next point I want to make is that you consider that flexibility has to be accompanied by social protection, and this is fine. But how? And that's where really I have a difficulty. I think your solutions seem to be all, or nearly all, top-down. This is legal, political, decision from technicians or technocratic bodies, but nowhere do I see the need for dialogue, for negotiation, for enhancing representative democracy, including trade unions and including employers, by the way. I think we need to have strong employers' organizations. And as far as I'm concerned, so long as the solution will be top-down, there will be no solution. We know by experience that where flexibility has been working, it is where it has been negotiated. In Germany, in the Nordic countries, in Belgium, and in other countries where labor market rules and labor market functioning is discussed with the people that are concerned. And that, I think, I haven't seen it in the report. Now, the objection that is made very often is that, oh, you know, trade unions are very weak, they are disappearing, and they are no longer important. Well, they are, on the one side, I can agree, trade unions have a lot of difficulties because of the changing nature of the labor market, but they still exist. And in many countries where the governments have understood the value of representation, well, there is a better stability and better growth than in other countries. I'm not going to give examples for the sake of time, but really I think it's a point that has to be made, that when politicians understand the importance of having proper, structured organizations, then they are safer. Let me just mention the problems developing in France now, where you have protests, but no one you can really talk to. And when you have a trade union organization, maybe they are a pain in the neck, yeah, but at least when they take a decision, then you know it is a decision. So that was the next point. Then my next point is the universality of social assistance. Yes, we are, and I am for universality of social assistance. But the reality might be that this social assistance is low, much lower than the actual unemployment benefit that a worker would get when he or she is unemployed. The reality of this universalism might be that you are lowering the financial coverage that people have when they have a problem. And I think it is, it's really difficult. And here I might quote the European Commission, because I think it's they have been making a very good point. What they say is that the actual coverage of workers with a proper contract now should be extended to all sorts of other contracts. And that's not a trade union saying it. We have been saying that for a long time. But now the European Commission is also saying it. And I hope the World Bank could say that as well, but that might be a bit too much to ask. Okay, on the tax base to be extended to capital, yeah, but as you know better than I do, capital is moving everywhere, and I don't know how the World Bank could help in solving that problem to expand the tax base of capital. And my last point, but I certainly don't want to make it a key point, is that it's difficult for me to see in this report points for Central Asia. I mean, I admit I don't know these countries. I know how just as much as you do. But I find the report is much more reflecting on Europe as the Europe we know here. It doesn't mean that, you know, I would dismiss the figures, but I found the title was not actually probably reflecting Central Asia, but you might contradict me. You know better than me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also for this number of critical comments that I noticed, and I think there is a number of good points for discussion, and I'm sure that Maurizio would love to respond. But before that, since time is running, and in fact in the program we also promised that the Q&A session will start at 2, which is basically right now. So let me open the floor for questions and comments. We have a couple of rounds. And maybe I would also ask you to respond to the comments of the two discussants maybe at the end of the first round. So if you would like to talk, please raise your hand. And if you get the microphone, please first introduce yourself briefly and try to have your question or comment briefly, because I see many hands. So many people will need to opportunity. Maybe let's start here.
Thank you. Michael Castagnera from the University of Brussels. Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. I would like just to ask a very specific point on the data you've shown about the declining fortunes of the young. So I see two changes. One is a continuous change in technology and the type of jobs we have. Another one is a massive shock in 2011 that increased dramatically unemployment between 2011 and 2014. I checked it peaked in 14 for Spain, for instance. And so when I see the data, I see that those who are born in, I think it was 79, fared very well, and those born in 1980 fared dramatically bad. And so is that a temporary shock? So the situation will resolve by itself when unemployment goes down again in the years to come? Or is it something more like a permanent shock that we need to, I mean, the way we need to address the problem is pretty different if it's one or the other.
There was a lady at the back.
It has been raised in, sorry, Catherine Fiore, EU reporter. It has been raised by one of the other speakers, but can you say a little bit more about how flexible part-time workers can secure the same rights? You know, have you looked into any sort of particular mechanisms, any examples where that works well? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Andras Laszlo. Allow me a provocative question. The lead-up email said dissatisfaction with the status quo and trust deficit. So the title says towards a new social contract, but for whom? For the system or for the people? If we are considering the climate everywhere, the yellow vest, the students in Belgium who are going on the streets, if we consider that in Davos, they say every year they say 88 families owe as much as 4 billion on the planet. So what are we talking about? Is this another beautifully designed report, but it doesn't change anything for the people?
Thank you. And the gentleman here, and then we have some responses, and then we have another round too.
Thank you very much. Jan Corneli, I'm a candidate for the European elections for the Flemish Social Democrats. Two quick questions. You've shown us a slide with inequality per age cohort, with the inequality of France going up from Japan-like levels to Chilean type levels, and the one of Germany being fairly flat. Now, if I relate that to your three principles, I'm wondering, it's not like in Germany they've been doubling down on these three principles, and in France they've given up on them. So where does this actual divergence between France and Germany come from? That's one question. The second is on further on those three questions, three principles, in a Eurozone context, because these principles are more or less pillars of the welfare state, you could see in them. So in a Eurozone context, are there any specific analysis or recommendations on that? Because if you look at taxation, there's been no coordination of tax policy, there's no reinsurance of welfare states, there's no sort of governance of social impact of intra-EU labor migration. So it's interesting to put these three principles there, but in a Eurozone context, it seems to me like we're handicapped on a more macro level than on a policy level.
Thank you very much. So, Maurizio, maybe if I can ask you to first answer these four questions. One was on temporary versus permanent issue that we see for the young. The other one was on the workers' rights for flexible and part-time workers. The other one is who is it whole thing is for, and German-France divergence and the three priorities or principles. And then after some of the comments of the two discussants, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the question and the comments. We don't have all the answers. We want to open a debate, so it's I don't know all the details, but it's important to have this debate. So the figures that I showed you in terms of the declining fortune of the youngs are simply descriptive figures. So I don't have a model that controls for whatever is the demand and supply. They did a similar studies published in the American Economic Review for the U.S. And one of the reasons that they find this flattening of the wage profile is, since they find that both quantity and wage, so there is less employment and less, and the wage, the price is going down, they think that is a demand side issue. So there is less demand for certain degrees, which is linked to technology. So they are favoring more the long-term trends than the short-term shock. If we have a longer term, if we have more observations, and we can, and it's imperfect, I'm going a little bit technical, but there are econometric techniques to disentangle the time effect, the cohort effect, the age effect, but you have to make some assumptions, so it's not easy to answer your question. There may be both things playing a role, but in the report, we don't go to disentangle these effects in detail. So, so much for that. The question on, I'm not sure I understood it completely, but let me answer what I understood. There is in my professor of macroeconomics in Torino when I was an undergraduate is Elsa Fornero, which was Ministry of Labor in Italy, and the labor reforms that they did, the counter reform that they did, it was actually really to go towards a more level playing field and protecting equally part-time, temporary worker and others. In East Asia, actually, in the eastern part of the region, there has been, it's much more equal, the protection of temporary versus permanent worker. In the Netherlands, they have done quite a bit of equalization of rights. So there are examples where the policy direction is going towards what we suggest. There are other interesting things that a recent paper showed that, for example, there is, even if it's actually harder to disentangle the preference there. There is an example where they had very good data on Uber drivers, and the female Uber drivers earn less than male Uber drivers. So there is a wage gap, which is, to the firm, it seems absurd because they don't have a difference, a wage premium for males, but it's actually a preference of women. Women tend to drive in certain period of the day where there is less demand because it's not towards the evening, etc. So there is less demand. So since the prices varies with demand, they are less present when the prices are high, but it's by preference, not by any rules. So it's complicated, this story. I am not sure. I'm not sure what you mean by for the system versus the people. I don't know exactly what the system is, so maybe we can discuss a bit there. But let me say that it's a fairly radical idea. The talking about social contract, and in my own institutions, we tend to deal with governments. Our mandate is to have a policy dialogue with governments. And we don't necessarily involve a dialogue with the civil society, with unions, with firms, private sector, by statute, because that's what we were built. And so, indeed, when you talk about the social contract, you should have everybody around the table. It's not about reforming a government proposal or reforming the system as is. It's really, let's sit around the table and let's discuss how we want to organize the society. We don't have the instrument as the institution as we are designed, but that's the spirit of the thing. And the social contract is a contract, so it's something that is negotiated and everybody agrees. Okay. The inequality, France versus Germany. Okay, so there are many things that may be behind this difference, there are even other differences that I don't show, which is these are differences within groups of age groups that are on income. If we look at the within group differences in consumption is much lower for all the countries, which means that there is some intergenerational transfer going on that is changing this profile that we see. So it is possible that in Germany, also for the income, there is some smoothing and some reduction of the disparities because of intergenerational transfer. But I'll have to look more carefully to be able to answer that. The Eurozone system, how to coordinate fiscal policy. Okay, so Piercarlo Padoan, Minister of the Economy, he came to Washington a couple of years ago, and he was really talking about the issue that he was discussing the possibility of having a Minister of Finance at the EU level for the same reason that we don't have it. And so indeed there are issues of coordination, but even when we have good coordination at the central bank level, so monetary policy is fully coordinated in the Eurozone, but I don't think we are looking at the impact of a decade or more of low interest rates into the impact that it has on relative prices. So let me clarify that. There has been a coordinated policy has helped with growth, has helped with inflation, but has also created very much a difference in relative prices. Asset prices, people owning capital and housing have been benefited by lots of liquidity and low inflation and low interest rates. And so there has been, those who own these assets have become richer than those who don't. So there has been, the monetary policy has created a relative price gap that has created distributional tensions. So not only we have issues with, and I'm not saying that we should rethink of the monetary policy because it's a complicated story, but even when we have coordinated policy, it can have distributional impact. When you don't, even more so. By the way, and that's a comment, an answer already to some of the comments, one of the things that we don't do in the report, and that has been mentioned, is that we look at a national social contract, a country-by-country social contract. And even if you get the best one, and all the policies are in place, a lot of national policy have limited efficacy in remedying problems that are linked to cross-border issues. You mentioned migration, trade, technological change, etc. So the sovereign countries, and even the World Bank, the main instrument is the sovereign policy loan. We influence at best one country policy, but these policies are limited in their results because of these. So you said that in an era of where multilateralism is in higher demand, there is much less supply of that. So, so that's a limitation. Some of the deep solutions will only happen if there is more multilateral, higher level policy intervention. Okay, so sure. Of course.
Yes and no. Yes and no on the capacity of national governments to act more forcefully on the question of inequalities. Just an example on wages. I don't think that national governments are so dependent on other countries. On the minimum wage, for instance, I mean, it's not really mentioned as a source of decreasing inequalities. But I think I mean, just saying it's no longer a question at national level, but it's a question that depends nearly exclusively on multilateral decision, is giving too much of an excuse for national governments and national policies to do their job. So I think there is still a large margin of maneuver to act at national level. That's what I wanted to say.
Ruby, would you like to say? Then
Okay,
please continue.
So now let's play with this for a moment. You just said at the end before that where you want to go with capital taxation, since capital is mobile. So you're saying on one hand, you're saying, oh look, there are mobility issues that is an international issue that is you're not going to get anywhere, and on the other hand, now you're saying no, there is margin. So. I know that you probably don't have an extreme position, and I don't either. It's true that it's difficult to tax capital because capital is a mobile factor, and it's also true that there is margin of maneuver. So, but if we agree, it's not fun anymore. So let's disagree a little bit. So the how to tax a mobile factor like capital. Okay, so the economist of all the periodicals, which is not really on the left, but he some time ago, I think December or before, had a leader and a whole special about overhauling the whole tax system, and one of the proposals that they had was actually we should tax more capital. And the way they go about and the way that the IPSP, the International Panel on Social Protection, Social Progress does is that, okay, so there's the capital is mobile, but the investors, the ownership is not necessarily mobile. So you can, and there is the technology now to know, the data to know, that even if your working capital moves to the cheapest possible tax regime, the owners stay in their own residencies, so they don't necessarily move to the tax haven. So there are ways of taxing ownership that is de-linked from where the capital is. The other thing is that there is this proposal that is, for example, there's nothing bad on leaving big inheritance, but it's not necessarily an equitable thing to receive a large inheritance. So So you could tax the recipient of big inheritance and not necessarily the incentive of leaving the large bequest. So there are ways. Tony Atkinson in his latest book talks about, okay, if we can tax, and he links the two things together. If we can tax the inheritance, and with the revenues of that tax, we can finance an endowment for all people at 15 years old. When they become 15, they have these rights of an endowment. It's an alternative to the UBI, and it's something that can be considered. Now, in terms of the many comments that you have, I can pick and choose a little bit on something. So the heterogeneity across countries, I have no way of showing that. It's a regional report, so it's a limitation. We have to generalize somehow. What I can say is that indeed, while the challenges that globalization, technological change, aging are common, as you pointed out, countries are very different, not only in the institutional setting and the policy response that they have, but also in the level of development. Turkey is very different than Russia, or than Georgia, or than Poland, or than France or Germany. So these challenges are digested by the system and manifest themselves in different tensions. So we don't find those tensions same and equal in level and intensity across all countries. In some countries we find one, in some countries we have found another one. So the report has that, but emphasizing in the storyline, emphasizing the diversity, you get lost, and so I don't emphasize that very much, but there is more in the report. In terms of looking forward, that is something that you were pointing out. What happens to the gender and migrants if this digitalization, technology change continues, etc. Again, the education has been equalized and has decreased the difference in terms of educational attainment between genders very much, but not so much in terms of wages and earnings, as you point out. One proposal that if we are looking for a broader tax base that was advanced is that we could tax rents in general. Taxing rents are not necessarily associated to productive activity, so can be taxed. And one rent could be the male premium. So because you are a male and you earn more than equally qualified and working hard women, why you are earning more? So that could be a tax base. Maybe doesn't produce a lot of revenue, but that's a proposal, taxing that rent. That may do something to that. So there's something that, and there are other studies that the WDR on the transforming world of work will look at these things. So we're looking at the future a bit. Yes.
So I'd like to have another round.
Sure. So I haven't even responded to everything, but that's
open, and any burning. I know you have many other questions. For example, I would also just hear your response to the question of flexibility and the trade
yes.
union. But first, let's have another round.
That flexibility is important.
Some comments from the floor and questions, and then in a final round, hopefully you can squeeze in short answers to all. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands. Okay, then let's go in this order. So please over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Johan Barros and I'm from Accountancy Europe. I would like to return to a very specific topic that was lightly touched upon, which is taxation. And I would also like to link taxation to what Ruby brought up on the sustainability and environmental side. So would the panelists foresee the possibility of having a social contract in which we have, for example, a tax system that's more focused on taxing environmentally harmful activities, whether it is by companies when they produce things or consumers when they consume things, and whether this could be then accompanied by equivalent reductions in labor taxation and company taxation, for example. And a follow-up question to that would be, how would you then make this into a progressive environmental tax system? Because of course, for example, I don't know, solar panels are quite expensive, so the poorest people of the society could not necessarily afford them, so they might be penalized by a poorly designed environmental tax system. So I would very much like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. The lady over there.
Yes, thank you. Law from Eurodiaconia, social NGO. So in your various interventions in the presentation of the social contract and your comments that followed up, we're talking about both economic, employment, social policies all together, and indeed economic and social policies interact with each other. They are completely interrelated, one impacts the other. And yet we see both at EU level and different governments that policies in these two areas especially, so economy on the one side, social on the other, are done by two different ministries or by two different DGs, which leads to inconsistencies sometimes in terms of policy actions. So how do you see this as a problem, and what do you see we could do to solve this? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I'm Konstantin Pashev and I work for the European Commission. I would like to ask you, because I hear several times about migration, but do you have empirical evidence? Did you find empirical evidence that migration has negative impact on the Gini coefficient, that the level of migration, for example, if you look at countries, the higher the level of openness of countries to external flows leads to higher Gini coefficient, which is kind of normal perhaps to expect, but I wonder if there is empirical evidence on that. And also in this thought, in this way of thinking also, did you find empirical evidence that east-west flows increase the Gini coefficient, the enlargement and, in Europe I mean, the enlargement and the free movement of workers? Because a lot of these perceptions that you mentioned, they are very much nurtured on these ideas about social dumping, about people, these cheap truck drivers coming from Eastern Europe, and the Polish plumber, if you want, and all these things. But did you find any empirical evidence that the Gini coefficient in the West is very much influenced by these dynamics? Because this is the discussion nowadays in Europe about the impact of, for example, enlargement and freedom of movement from east to west on the inequality in Europe. And as a whole, I think that, I haven't read the report, but I think from what I heard, perhaps Eastern Europe is a little bit underrepresented. You mentioned at some point that there is a different story for Eastern Europeans, but what exactly is the story? Because Eastern Europeans, they started with very high level of perceptions and fairness, because the transition started not with redistribution of income, but redistribution of wealth accumulated. And of course, by no means it could have been fair. And even the World Bank at the time was stressing on efficiency, not on fairness. And then came convergence. You told us that we are kind of the Europe. The EU is the powerhouse of convergence in this Golden Growth report. Did convergence also drive this Gini coefficient? Yeah, and last sentence about taxation. I'm not sure I understood you correctly, but you said that the tax base is very much gone to taxation of labor. I thought that trend is different, that we move to taxation of consumption rather than labor. And if something can make taxation fair, it's to increase the taxation of labor. But of course, this is not acceptable because this makes distortion. But do you have empirical evidence that higher inheritance tax, because it's very easy to circumvene, brings to fairness of taxation?
Thank you. And the last question over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Hernan. I work as researcher for Oxfam International. Thank you. The excellent report. I'm here. And he was looking to me. And thank you to Bruga for this debate. Some comments. The first one, I think one of the main, when you were talking about challenges and cleavage, I think for us, one of the most important things is like this differentiation between the short-term versus long-term, which is related with technology, and the impact that it has in participation of in politics of people. You've been talking a lot about economic inequality. You mentioned a bit like inequality of opportunities, but I'm missing something about political inequalities. You talk about the level playing field in terms of access to labor market, but what level playing field in terms of access to politicians, in terms of public procurement for companies, in terms of international taxation. I mean, we're talking about like taxes, labor taxes, capital taxes, but what about international taxation, avoidance, evasion? I think that's something very important. And then last but not least, you mentioned like different items related with a stable social contract, and I think one of the things which should be more important is access to, one of the key elements of a stable social contract is when you feel that you can access your political system, you can access politicians, you can participate. That goes beyond transparency. And I think that's something that's missing from the report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have less than a minute. But let me give all three of you some brief responses.
Okay, in less than a minute, the question of taxes and environment is a very complicated one. I think we have advocated for fair transition. That means that you can't just increase the cost of fuel for all people without looking at it. It's a very complicated issue, but you need to be active on environment, but also compensate or try to find a solution for those who are going to be badly affected, including on their own employment. The question of economic and social issues being very mixed, yes, indeed. And there are two options for that. First of all, the economic policies that are influencing social issues, they do exist in the Eurozone in particular. So we have to be very active on what sort of economic policies are put in place. I'm not going to go into any detail, but you also have the soft policies. When an organization is recommending over flexibility or is recommending to keep minimum wages fairly low, then it's also soft policy that has an impact. So we have to mix the two. And the last thing on the interconnection between economic and social issues, it's difficult to say that the EU now has to go for more legislation at European level on social issues because people want more at their level. But on social dialogue, on the need for trade union, on the need for democratic representation, I think the EU can still do a lot. It was more than a minute.
Okay, so I'll be briefer then, and I'll just follow up on this in response to your question, to your comment actually on who deals, so Ministry of Finance, Economy on the one hand, and let's say the Ministry of Employment. In the case of the Commission, which I know better, the part of this process of the Pillar of Social Rights has been about bringing the discussion to the heads of state and government so that you can have a whole of government approach to it. So not have just the ministers of employment talk about in social affairs. So it's about taking it up a notch, but precisely for this reason. And the way the current commission is organized, yes, there is DG Employment, DG ECFIN, but they work together through the way the college is organized with the vice president and Commissioner Tyson kind of working together. And the way that the European semester has been adjusted with the social indicators is exactly to bring these together. Now, just to zoom out of Europe, I wanted to mention one example of Monday where we had the New Zealand delegation, government that was in Brussels, and we met, and it was the Minister of Finance of New Zealand who wanted to talk about the future of work. And I thought that was probably the most interesting discussion I've had in a while, because exactly he said, I don't want to be responsible for bailing out. I want to find ways to have the discussion from my Ministry of Finance on the future of work. So it's happening. And I mean, I think there's a clear realization. And over to you for the hard ones. Okay.
We're very selective, so it's really hard to show that equity is efficiency friendly. But it is possible, so we should move really beyond thinking that equity is only a moral issue is straight into the core of the research that I look at, and I contribute a little bit. So it is I think now resolve that. So it's beyond just avoiding social turbulence. Equity can be helpful for growth. On the flexibility of the labor market, I don't want to say that you misquote me, but I don't want to say that I am a pro flexibility, but definitely I am against flexibility when it is only for a segment of the market. So if we have to have a flexible market, it has to be, everybody has to be flexible, not just, and what has happened in Europe has been that there are dualistic markets and the flexibility is only for someone. So how to go from there? You reduce the flexibility and protect more those who are exposed, yes. So that's I don't have a position. What we say is that it's likely that if you erect walls and avoid engaging with the global economy, you probably will be worse off. So if you want to engage, you will have to have some flexibility, and so you have to do something about that. By the way, jobs have externalities, and so protecting some jobs and not just people may be good, but we have not gone there yet. Final thing on political inequality that was mentioned. Yes, we have a line of research that is not in this report, but is in another publication where we look at the rules of the game. There is a whole governance issue, especially you asked about the Eastern European countries. The story there is of collusions between government and firms. There are a lot of politically connected firms that are avoiding to play by the rules and get cost advantages, and not necessarily are the most efficient, or they get captured because they are efficient, and then so there is a whole issue of governance that is important, and how to access, how to reform the rules of the game politically, the representation, how the voting system, the electoral system, the lobbying, the communication, the media. It's a huge other areas that I invite you to look at the IPSP, the International Panel for Social Progress. They have something that they say there, but probably will be next report for us. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. We were 5 minutes over time, but I think that the richness of the report indeed just shows that it's able to generate such an insightful and interesting debate and discussion. So without further ado, let me thank the three speakers for making these very interesting contributions, and all of you for being here and also raising many interesting and sometimes very difficult questions, and also providing some food for further research too. So thanks again. Thank you very much.